transformation process. One of the things that I'm, involved in right now, I'm the past chair of the Building Codes and Standards Committee for the AIA, and I've also been asked to be on a committee for ICC this year, looking at the whole code development process. So I'm looking forward to that. I've already been involved in the code development process on a few occasions, both with the existing building code and currently with the fire code for 2021. And I've also been involved in code compliance issues in the city of Chicago and dealing with some performance-based solutions. So we'll talk about that a little bit as well. I did look up Wichita and saw that we have been on the 2012 IBC as well as the International Fire Code, as well as the Residential Code, but that your mechanical and plumbing and fuel gas code are on the 2015 codes. And there was some notice on the web with regards to updating to the 2018 code for the mechanical, plumbing, and fuel gas. So it leads me to believe that if you're going to be switching to the latest version of IBC, you'll actually be jumping to iterations. And we'll talk about that a little bit as well. And then you have several non-ITC codes that you're dealing with, certainly the ASPE code for elevators and for and the NFPA obviously for the electrical code and for sprinklers and fire protection, as well as your own self-written codes for prefabricated assemblies and manufactured homes, pole barns and deck standards and structure moving. That's slide 4. Sorry, we have the switch already. And then on the next slide, we're just going to go through some of the transitions really from 2012 to 2015 and 2018. And I pulled these out selectively because obviously we could go on for the rest of the afternoon to talk about the various changes that are happening, but I just wanted to selectively take a couple of them and then highlight one of the more significant ones to talk about. This one, on slide 5, talks about opening a room to a corridor in the type I2 nursing homes. So this was changed in 2015 to allow shared living spaces to have some open spaces to the corridors. And you can see that there's 5 specific conditions that have to be met in order for that to be allowed. There's, in 2018, almost exactly the same illustration on the next slide, slide 6, to show assisted living units. So they basically took that same provision and added additional criteria for the allowance of having a room or space open to a corridor. And so this method of changing the code typically takes some time. And if you're looking at 2 iterations rather than 1, and I don't know if some of you have been involved in the actual code adoption process in your municipality, but typically people on a committee will sit down and go through chapter by chapter the various changes that have occurred and decide whether or not they're going to accept them or keep what was previous, or make some kind of change in the interim. So, and typically to do that, you would have a book of the latest version, whatever version you're looking at, and in there would be notations as to what was changed. Usually there's a vertical bar next to the paragraphs and sections that were changed. So in order to go from the 2012 to the 2018, you really need essentially two books to look at, or three, to look at the changes that have occurred in the interim 6 years. So this kind of thing, when you're looking at the 2018, for example, you can see that the 2015 changes or where that happened. So in this particular instance, the entire section sometimes changes, or certain paragraphs change, and that kind of thing. So another change that occurred in 2018, they reorganized the criteria for addressing allowances for the requirement for clean spread testing on interior surfaces, so they can have a better understanding of where those references are located. So it's in 803 1.1 and 803 1.2, and then there's a jump really from 803.2 to 803.13, where additional testing criteria is provided for various finishes. So those are the kind of things that, again, need addressed through a code adopting process. Now, one of the more important ones, I think, that were changed in the code had to do with the outflow for business use. And in 2012, as it has been for many decades, the business use calculation for floor area allowance per occupant has been 100 square feet per person. In 2018, it was changed to 150 gross square feet per person. And it's indicated in slide 8 here how that looks. So essentially, they indicate that that was the only change in 2018. So that really isn't the only change, because load, as you probably know, determines both the exit capacity and the required number of plumbing fixtures. It could also have an effect on other aspects of the design as well. So, and how that's going to be dealt with going forward in terms of alterations and that kind of thing, it's a little unclear. So, going to the next slide, slide number 9. This is a chart of the NFPA 101 updates to business occupancy by year, and you can see that in 2012. It was the same number, 100, and in 2015, that's when the element of the business use that was separated out from concentrated business use, because again, in certain instances, we've had businesses who either use call-in centers or other more dense layouts for business use that finally has been recognized in the code to give it a number. And essentially, that number was determined to be 50 square feet per person. So now we have business use and concentrated business use. And in the next iteration of the 2018, they decided to change the business use from 100 square feet per person to 150. So now you have a change in that number, and then separate number for concentrated business use. And, oh, by the way, there's two more that they have identified for calculation purposes, and those are the collaboration rooms. So anything at 450 square feet or less that is considered to be a collaboration space would be calculated at 30 square feet per person. And if it is larger than 450 square feet, that number then changes to 15 square feet per person. Essentially the same as for tables and chairs in a restaurant. So there's quite a bit of differences that would be involved in calculating occupancy for business use, which is obviously one of the more prevalent occupancies that are reviewed by examiners and building departments. So if we're paying attention, to these changes and the new edition of the code comes out and becomes adopted in the jurisdiction, it could be something of a surprise. Because again, it would affect exiting, and it would affect money fixed accounts, as well as the allowable numbers on the floor. Okay, next slide. And this has to do with distance between exits. So up until like 1988, there was no specific way of measuring the minimum distance between two exits when you were required to have two exits from the building or from space. Then, I believe, again, NFPA Life Safety Code, they started the change to effectively prescribe a distance of no less than 1/2 a diagonal dimension, the longest diagonal dimension in whatever shape building or space we're looking at to provide two exits. So, and then they modified that to allow for a sprinkler building 1/3 diagonal to separate the two exits. Now, when you run into having a requirement for 3 exits, typically over 500 people, there was no verbiage on how distant that is. And so they played around with that. There was performance language in 2000, 2003, but then they removed it in 2006 because they thought it was too subjective. So they've now reinstated it with what they think is a less subjective term by saying a reasonable distance apart to prevent both one that's nearest to it and what the third exit is from being blocked. So it doesn't necessarily make a huge change, but it at least clarifies the issue with regards to the number of exits for where they're located. Next slide. Locking arrangements in educational occupancies. This is a big issue, obviously, because of shooting incidents and the code has reacted to it because of the level of safety this has, again, been expanded really. It was limited to exterior doors, and now it is no longer limited to exterior doors to essentially allow, in certain situations, a key lock for a door in an interior space to occur, so that in that occurrence, that door can be locked. Now, again, there are certain occupancy types that this covers. So Group A, Group B, Group F, and S, places of religious worship are covered by this provision. And in this case, you do have to have a sign, like you would in a rental space, to indicate that the door is to remain unlocked when the space is occupied. So similar to situations where you have, say in a mall, a door that can be locked after hours, and you still have personnel inside. And that's perfectly allowable, but in the situation where there is occupied use of the space, then that door would have to remain unlocked. Okay, next slide. This has to do with delayed egress locking systems, and delayed egress locks have proliferated over the course of the last 20, 25 years. Again, it's one of those situations where technology and concerns of the building users has been such that there is need to provide some kind of additional security than what was originally allowed in the code. And so essentially the delayed egress provide some level of safety in that even though the door is locked in the direction of egress, it can be unlocked with someone pushing on the door with a force of 15 pounds. And it's delayed because there will be an alarm that's down, and then within 15 or 30 seconds, the door will open. So delayed egress lock devices are now permitted on routine classrooms with an occupancy load less than 10. Also permitted in courtrooms as a means of egress doors other than the main doors where the building is perimeter. And of course, the building must have a fire sprinkler system throughout in order to allow the use of the delayed egress device. Okay, next slide, 14 now. I'm going to talk about some of the changes to the washrooms. And again, this has been an interesting conversation going back and forth between advocacy groups and municipalities and code officials, legislators, having to do with the number and use of washrooms. And so additional fixtures now, if they're designated as family or assisted use toilet rooms, have child height water closets in addition to the standard height, and the same is true for the lavatory. This would provide additional accommodation, but again, on an applicable basis, so it's allowable without necessarily meeting the requirement. Number 15, single-user toilet rooms. So you can now count single-user toilet rooms toward required fixture counts, even where family or assisted use facilities business classifications with 25 or fewer occupants, to have a separate sex facility, even though they still require the same number of fixtures. They're not designated, or they can be designated without reference to sex. So these are socially related issues that develop into requirements of the code, or exceptions, I should say, to allow for certain things. Because again, something like this, if a legislative body, for example, wanted to change it, they would necessarily know the ins and outs of what the requirements are in the plumbing code, and this is from the plumbing code 2902. So the references that may otherwise be missed as part of legislation is sometimes a problem, and so this is clearly something that was needed in the code and was proposed and was passed for the 2018. Another addition to the 2018 code had to do with relocatable buildings, and so compliance is required in the same way that it would be for new construction or a trailer. It has to have an address. There could be supplemental information in regards to a reference to the code requirement as it would be for, say, the 2012 IBC or the 2015 IBC, or whoever is doing this would have to identify which code that the manufactured or relocatable building was built to be in compliance with. It also requires the manufacturer natively to basically certify that building was built in accordance with that code and those sets of requirements. And then whatever inspection agencies were involved in the inspection, because the inspection would have been off-site. And that's a perfectly acceptable kind of situation. But it's one of those things that wasn't really dealt with very much in the code before. Another issue that cropped up mostly because of fires in buildings during construction, and when the code started allowing what they call podium-type buildings, where you have one or two floors that are concrete or essentially non-combustible construction, and on top of that you build type 5 construction, and wood is something you see sometimes in the news that a fire occurred in one of these buildings. I don't believe it's happened anywhere when the building was completed, because typically these buildings would have been provided a sprinkler system. But in those situations where the building is under construction and the sprinkler system is not active and a fire occurs, it can be pretty devastating and can affect adjacent buildings as well. So the code now requires a fire watch during construction, and that fire watch would be as determined really by the code official. beneficial to simply refer to that code in its entirety. And that code has about 15 chapters to it. So it's a much more expanded version of that chapter. So previously, they only had really information now included in Chapter 4 of the International Building Code and 14, actually it's now 13 in 2018, the performance compliance methods. So those are all replicated from Chapter 34 and provided as part of the existing building code. So anyone adopting the 2015 or the 2018 will certainly understand that there is no provisions for existing buildings. And in order to provide for that set of requirements, you would either have to adopt and modify the existing building code or write your own, or in the case of New York, when they switched to the International Building Code, they took Chapter 34 out themselves and basically referred to the previous code from 1968 as being the existing building. There's lots of different ways, to handle those kind of things, but the understanding is at this point that if you're going to adopt the IBC, you're probably going to have to adopt the IEBC as well and deal with it that way. And also, of course, the challenge is to match those versions, because even though you may have certain of the model codes from 2012 and certain of those models of 2015 version and some model codes from 2018, they don't necessarily all coordinate if you're using different versions, right? So the assumption is that if everything is under 2015 or if everything is under 2018, that there was some correlation going on between the various codes so that there is more consistency. There would be much less consistency when you are dealing with codes that are not on that same cycle. Another addition to the 2018 was basically taking a standard that was developed by ICC, published by ICC, from a committee that dealt with guidelines essentially for what is called replicable buildings. What is a replicable building? Well, that's a building that can be essentially the same design, but built on a different site. Well, what can I say about technology? Anyway, so a replicable building that has been reviewed in a plan review environment already can be essentially
You're sideways.
Oh, I'm sorry.
There you go.
Yeah, this is much better when it's sideways, but I understand what you're trying to do here, so. Okay. So what I'm going to do is hold it now. Make sure that it doesn't fall. And the reason that there's a photograph of the target store on different comments for the building, and it becomes frustrating because every time you submit the same building to different building departments under the same model code, and it's not just about the adjustments or amendments that may have been provided, but about the fact that it was reviewed by plan reviewers and maybe different opinions about what was important, what was not important. So they initiated the standard that they then advocated for adding to the building code as an appendix. Now, appendices to the building code are not part of an adoption process. You have to adopt each and every appendix separately and intentionally in order for those to be part of your municipal code requirements. So anyone adopting in 2018, if they don't adopt the appendices, one or more of them, and since this one is appendix N, there's a lot of them. They're not part of the code. And so, I mean, you can still use them, but officially they would not be part of the code. And so there would have to be some way of dealing with that, either through a amendment process or a way of getting variance. So, but the understanding here is that with reputable buildings, you could have a more uniform review process because essentially it would be reviewed once and be able to be done on a different site in the same municipality without any additional reviews. And it would reduce the time between the permit submittal and the construction mobilization. Because again, in the regulatory review environment, no one wants to wait for anything. No one wanted to wait for anything 20 years ago, and certainly no one wants to wait for anything today. And the assumption is that the more you can create a situation where you're eliminating some of the time delays, the better off you are. Next slide talks a little bit about what we're dealing with in 2021. So the most significant one there is the change to construction types. That has to do with specifically tall wood buildings. Now, if you haven't heard about this, you're going to hear about it because essentially this was the most talked about, most controversial change to the 2021 codes. It essentially was the work of the wood industry as well as sustainability groups, and they did a very good job of getting it done the first time. So we'll be part of the 2021 code. Next slide shows what we're talking about here. So tall wood buildings are going to be part of, in addition to type 4 construction. So in addition to type 4 heavy timber, which was the traditional building that's been around for more than a century, they will have 3 new types. Type 4A that can go up to a maximum of 18 stories. Type 4B with a maximum of 12 stories, which will have some limited area of exposed mass timber walls and ceilings. Whereas the type 4A will not. And then type 4C that can go up to 9 stories with all exposed mass timber, with the assumption that that exposed mass timber would meet a 2-hour fire resistance. And so one of the ways in which they were able to pass this was to run many, many tests and mock-ups of this mass timber construction in various scenarios and be able to outside is timber, except for water barrier that meets the requirements in 1402 for installation. Next slide. I just want to just go through a little bit here, examples of pending 2021 code changes. These were from comments that were issued from Oklahoma National to talk about the concerns they had or support they had for various changes to the code. And we'll look at just a few of these. So, for example, use of fire curtains for use of atriums and other fire-related locations, which is being added to the building code. So anything you see in G proposal, that's really for the building code. The next one is an F proposal, so that's really for the fire code. That allows HDPE and PP materials for toilet and urinal partitions. Those are basically plastic, like lounge partitions for those urinal partitions that were not referenced before in the code, and so and as you can imagine, as building owners and managers, they were delighted to see more use of those because they're less expensive. So certain of these, again, they supported, certain things they did not. Requirement that storage should be contained as a requirement that no storage should be contained in elevator lobbies. That's on slide 27. Adding sprinkler requirements to be open parking structures, at least 48,000 square feet. There has been some concern lately about requirements for parking structures that they were not given the concern that they should have. In certain instances, there have been fires in parking garages. Maybe not so much about the cars themselves, but there's certainly more plastic involved in cars than there are metal these days, and so there's just more concern about it. Increased to type 2A allowable areas for open parking garages. This is the next slide, 28. The next one there, G86, revises and simplifies the frontage increase calculation methods to include some chart. That seems to make sense because anytime they have a calculation in the building code, it can in fact confuse people. So anything that would make that frontage increase calculation, I think, a little bit easier to deal with, makes sense. Code changes addressing identification of elevators that are used for occupant evacuation. That's, again, something where you'd have a super tall building to allow an elevator to be used as egress, so it doesn't really affect a lot of buildings. Then a whole bunch of fire safety proposals having to do, for example, with standards for intumescent paint, which is being used, I think, a lot more these days, not necessarily identified to the extent necessary sometimes for building owners to address so they don't get painted over, kind of thing. Dealing with changes to party walls, that's been And so, how do codes get changed? All right, so the ICC has what they call the governmental consensus process, meeting the principles that are spelled out here on slide number 31. And slide number 31 goes through the four that are identified by the International Code Council as having been met in their process. So, and the key mechanisms that govern the ICC governmental consensus process include, on slide 32, open public forums, so that, and you don't pay for going to one of these public forums to hear and to testify at the hearings involved in reviewing proposed code changes. Decision transparency, all testimony committee recommendations are made in open public hearings. Those hearings, by the way, are viewable on the internet, so you can in fact watch, listen in to the hearings as they progress. Representation of interests of the committees are a wide range in terms of discipline. They have to fully disclose any kind of conflicts of interest. 1/3 of the committee members must be government members who have no financial or vested interest. If they do have some kind of conflict, they recuse themselves as part of the committee process on any given proposed code change. And membership on committees is not conditional on membership in the ICC, but the way it's structured, they do, again, try to get a wide range of people, and typically those people are recommended by certain associations. And that's how they get on the committee. Due process, so there's equal opportunity for rebuttal, there's ways in which these things can be vetted, there is an appeals process, but a simple majority is what the consensus standard is in terms of determining in the end what code changes go through and what they don't. Next slide, 34. The ICC Code Development Committee is composed of people who have specific knowledge and competence in the fields under discussion. And they could include building officials, design professionals, trade associations, building contractors, manufacturers, suppliers, government agency representatives, certainly, and any qualified individual with vested interest. So it's really a gamut of people who are involved in the building industry. And the final determination, next slide, 35, the final determination of code provisions is primarily in the hands of public safety officials. So in other words, you can attend these meetings, you can propose code changes, you just can't vote on the final decision as to whether or not something goes in the code or not, because those are reserved to the public safety officials. Whether or not that's a good idea. 33% of the committee's members are required to be regulatory experts in the field, so it's predominated by the regulatory industry. Okay, and it's one of the reasons I think that design professionals sometimes have confusion with regards to, well, why is this being required, and because it does, it sometimes limits design options, and it's not necessarily something that is taught about in schools, and so those limitations seem restrictive a lot of times to people who are trying to do more advanced types of buildings, let's put it that way. Next slide, slide 36. So the objectives of the code development process are to recognize and evaluate in a timely manner technological developments that may affect construction techniques and regulations, and host open debates, democratic discussion, and present final determination in code text that is part of a way of communicating that, and then creating an opportunity for all in the industry 10 steps, right? From the code change submittal in step 1 through a code change agenda posting to the code action hearings to online votes that have been allowed since, I guess, 2010. I think is when they initiated those. The results then are posted, public comments that are submitted, public comment agenda postings, public comment hearings have to occur, and of course there's time space between each of these until finally the consensus vote and the new edition is published. So that's an 18-month process. So let's just say you had a code you wanted to look at, revision in a code you wanted to look at, and you composed it and put it in the format that is required for submittal with a reasoning statement. And so that gets submitted. Okay, so you may not see the results of that, and you go through the hearings and you go through the other processes for at least a year and a half, and then the actual publication may not happen for another year or maybe a year and a half after that as well. So it's really over 3 years by the time something is initiated to the time it actually appears in an open code. So that's pretty long, okay? And there's a lot of time and money involved in that. That's really what the next slide shows. And then, so the next slide is about really watching paint dry, which is kind of the way the whole process looks sometimes and feels. So whether or not that's the best way of doing it, of course, in my experience, codes have never gotten any smaller or any shorter. They only seem to be getting longer and more complicated, and so but that's one of the reasons. I think the process involved in it. So there's no process involved in trying to consolidate or simplify the code. It's only about adding and taking away, and usually there's more added than taken away. The other concern on slide 40 here is the whole future of code officials. So there was a demographic survey done fairly recently in regards to what is going on with the personnel in terms of building departments and the whole regulatory arena. And essentially, we've seen since the Great Recession that these building departments are getting smaller, they're shrinking in size, regardless of what the size of the municipality is. Now, Wichita, of course, has 400, 500,000 people. If you had a city of 100,000 people, and you had the same size building department, you'd probably be overachievers. But in instances where people have been cut, or there's just no new people coming in to the areas of work, whether that's the plan examination or inspectors, that could be a problem. Which is why I think we're starting to see regulatory agencies free up on the idea of having outside parties or third-party plan reviewers and inspectors out there as well. The other thing that has been affecting concern with regards to building codes is severe weather. And so every time there's a new storm, there's more to learn about, but there's also issues involved in we now call trying to make buildings more resilient. And so resiliency has become like one of those words that you hear all the time. And what that really means and how to really achieve it, I think, has been of some concern. And then again, how do you make something more resilient? Well, and then the code strictly prescriptive requirements and something that's more performance-based. Unfortunately, the performance code option is not one that is often taken because of how complicated it looks and how it feels. But when design professionals are given that option, they usually go to town with it because, again, it's something where they feel like they are in control. Now they can figure out, okay, here's my building, it's what I designed, and now we can come up with a solution that maybe is not a prescriptive solution, but is one that will fit our custom-built building that is trying to achieve certain things that no one's ever done before. So there are ways of doing that. So this chart really kind of shows the steps to apply to that. And like I said, it is a very complicated process. A lot of code officials don't like it, but it is something that is out there and is in fact achievable. You do need specialized engineering and assistance in doing something like this. You basically have to, write a paper and essentially prove your point by example and or by testing. But there are ways of achieving that because certainly there are software programs now, modeling that you can use to prove the certain aspects of the code that are prescriptive don't fit your building. You can modify it and make a case essentially for doing it. The way the performance code format works, you understand what your intent and scope requirements are in the beginning there, and then state your objectives, provide a functional statement, and then what the performance requirement is in some measurable terms, and then your support documentation is attached to that. And whether that's done in that elaborate style or in a very simplified form, because currently in Chicago, for example, we have what's called a code alternative approach, basically, and you can modify certain aspects that are not in the code, but certainly achievable, and its review process is much simpler than having a committee look at it. But in certain cases, when things are more complicated, that's what you need as a committee, because again, most building departments and code officials don't want a single person to be the one necessarily making that determination. Next slide, 44, shows performance codes for existing buildings, and this has been around for quite some time. Essentially, this is in the existing building code, and it shows how a building can be evaluated. And there's about 19 various safety parameters that we go through to evaluate an existing building in terms of its conformance to current code requirements. This is something that again, NFPA, Life Safety Code 101A, alternative approaches to life safety have been around for many years. They're just not very popular because there's a lot of work involved in it, and once a code official is on board with you using this kind of a way of doing it, it becomes something you have to convince people of. So to close off here, what does the future building code regulation hold for the innovative practice of architecture? Well, at the AIA, as part of the Codes and Standards Committee, we developed a panel of individuals who were going to study what the future of building code regulation was going to be about, and so they wanted to essentially enhance the definition of health, safety, and welfare to encourage the profession to go beyond minimum code requirements, not just reference the prescriptive requirements, but really have a mandate really to not just deal with minimums, refine the basic education codes and standards, because in practice it doesn't seem like the training is as efficient as it could be. Design professionals as third-party reviewers and certifiers of compliance become more prevalent. streamline the co-development process I was going through with you earlier. So that's it. That's my presentation.